Hi there, everybody. It's Rabbi Leah, and welcome to Tuesday morning. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend. I'm hoping that the fireworks will finally stop. They started on Thursday night, and then Friday night, and then Saturday night, and have continued to pop off. And since there are no real organized fireworks shows this year, at least not in my neck of the woods, it seems to be people who are just kind of enjoying the festivities on their own. Not great when you have three little dogs, but what can you do? So, as I said, I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I hope you're hanging in there. I know these are tough times, but we're all doing the best that we can, and I'm here to bring you a little bit of knowledge and hopefully some interesting information as we continue along our study of the various Jewish movements, streams, branches, denominations, and whatever other word you'd like to choose. So last Thursday, I thought was going to be the last day that I talked about Reform Judaism, but I wanted to include just a couple of minutes here of some really crucial information. And there are really two things that I wanted to talk about because this is going to be kind of in distinct controversion or it's we're going to show some true distinctions between Reform Judaism and what I'm going to get into most of the time today, which is conservative Judaism, on two primary subjects, one of which is the role of women. So um, early on, Reform Judaism gave um, much greater role to women because of the fact that Reform Judaism was a much less halachically bound form of Judaism, and therefore the structure of orthodoxy, which was that women played, I'm not going to say a minor role, but a different role in Judaism. Women were not obligated to the time-bound uh, halacha, the time-bound mitzvot. Reform Judaism was much more flexible in the role of women, not only in structured congregational life, but also in um, being able to be on the bima, the celebration of bat mitzvah, the acceptance of women into the rabbinate, no longer seating women and men separately, and so on. Which was something radical and new as far as the various streams of Judaism were concerned. Um, Secondly, Reform Judaism, and I'm not saying the other streams of Judaism are not concerned, but Reform Judaism considered itself a prophetic form of Judaism, meaning much less emphasis was put on the priestly connection to the rites and the rituals and the stringency of the observances. And Reform Judaism began to lean much more heavily to the prophetic tradition, meaning the tradition of the prophets who talked about issues of social justice. Micah, uh, justice shall roll down like the waters. Um, uh, Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. And so Reform Judaism has always been the movement within the structure of all the different movements that was far more focused on social justice and social action and less on halachic rulings. So, from the early days, Reform Judaism was concerned with the widow, the orphan, the disabled, those who were marginalized by society, which is why Reform Judaism back in the 50s and 60s was so closely involved with the African American community in the civil rights movement. And of course, many of the early pictures you see of Martin Luther King and some of the other great African American leaders who are marching in the civil rights movement, there are the Reform rabbis marching right along with them. um, the movement to end the oppression of Soviet Jews, spearheaded by the Reform movement, women's rights, the rights of the LGBTQ community. All of these are seen by Reform Judaism as um, movements in which their involvement is key. And this is, you know, something that developed early and has always been part of Reform Judaism. So I just wanted to add that in there as something that kind of characterizes Reform Judaism um, in the world. I just noticed that, oh, I don't know what that was, but that was one of the dogs. I just noticed that I'm wearing my rabbi's Love Cheshvan t-shirt. So I'll digress for 30 seconds and tell you what this t-shirt is about. The month of Cheshvan is the month that comes after the month of Tishrei, in which all the Jewish holidays come: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchat Torah, and so on. And after that very long month of holidays comes the month of Cheshvan, and then we don't have anything until the month of Kislev, when Hanukkah comes. So these t-shirts kind of became popular. Rabbis love Cheshvan because it's a month in which we don't have a holiday. Doesn't mean it's a month in which we don't have anything to do. I'm wearing it now because so many of my colleagues who usually spend these summer months in intensive study, going to Israel to study at the Hartman Institute and Pardes and other venues, going to camps to work as rabbis on staff, obviously are not doing that this year in July and August. So it's kind of like Cheshvan all over again, trying to figure out things to do during these months. And there's plenty to do. So now we are going to move on to conservative Judaism, which in and of itself is an amazing tradition. And I learned so much in preparing for this, although I knew the basic tenets of conservative Judaism. It was not until I really began to study for this that I learned so much more. So, conservative Judaism in the Hebrew is known as Masorti. Masorti is the Hebrew word for traditional. So, when I use traditional in this sense, I'm talking not about orthodoxy, but in a Judaism that uh, it sees Jewish law as obligatory. However, in practice, there is a very, very broad range of practice and observance among conservative Jews, particularly in the United States. Historically, conservative Judaism has represented kind of a midpoint on the spectrum of observance between Orthodox and Reform. So they adopt certain innovations, for example, driving to synagogue but nowhere else on Shabbat, and a more gender egalitarianism in prayer in most synagogues, but still maintaining the traditional line on other matters, such as keeping kosher, such as intermarriage, such as uh, maintaining certain aspects of observance on Shabbat, and so on. And there are major institutions in conservative Judaism, just like they are in Reform Judaism. You have the Union for Reform Judaism, which is kind of this overarching organization to which many Reform congregations belong. For that, it is the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the USCJ. There are also a major seminary like Hebrew Union College for the Reform movement, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and then there is the Rabbinical Assembly, to which conservative rabbis, this is their professional organization, similar to the CCAR for Reform Rabbis, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So, very similar organizations. There's also the Ziegler School of Judaic Studies, which is a conservative seminary. So now we get to what is conservative Judaism all about? And uh, first of all, conservative Judaism is comprised of about 17%, or according to the Pew study, about 17 or 18% of all North American Jews consider themselves to be conservative. Now, again, self-identification is a very interesting thing, because some people may identify themselves according to a movement of Judaism in which they grew up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they adhere to or even know what the tenets of that practice are. And I'm always entertained by speaking with a conservative Jew or a Reform Jew about the specific tenets of their stream of Judaism, about which they had no clue, and would say, I had no idea that that's what Reform Judaism really stands for, or that's what conservative Judaism really stands for. That's really eye-opening, because I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to some of those tenets. So, um, from the very beginning, conservative Judaism was marked by kind of an ambivalence and an ambiguity in matters that were theological. So, Reform Judaism, or Orthodox Judaism, whereas it sees the Torah and all of the oral law, meaning that everything was given at Mount Sinai, the written law as well as the oral law, that all of it is directly from the mouth of God to Moses, that the Bible, the Torah is inerrant, meaning without error, and therefore perfect. Reform Judaism, which looks at the Torah as divinely inspired but written by human beings and not bound by halakha, which was created by human beings as a way to um, uh, enact the mitzvot in the Torah. How do we take this verse that says, do not cook a baby goat, in the milk of its mother, and then create this elaborate system of kashrut from it? So conservative Judaism maintained a more middle of the road, so to speak, attitude that held on to halakha, particularly where it had to do with issues of kashrut, Shabbat, intermarriage, and so on, but with a modern sensibility that living in the modern world, we had to be able to adapt and adjust somewhat. Um, Part of I'm going to use the word problem because it is a problem, and part of the reason why conservative Judaism has lost a considerable amount of its adherents, particularly over the last 2 to 3 decades, is because there has always been a significant um, chasm between the religious practice of the conservative rabbi and that of the conservative Jew in the pew. And so this difference is marked by a significant not changes in practice, but levels of practice. So, for example, a conservative rabbi will not drive on Shabbat, will only walk on Shabbat, will require a minyan for prayer, will absolutely keep kosher. Whereas, I'm not going to say most, but I'm going to say many conservative Jews will not subscribe to that level of halacha. They will drive on the Shabbos. They will not keep kosher, or maybe they'll keep kosher in their home, but won't keep kosher out. So they won't keep strictly kosher. So we have this divide between the clergy and the laity, which has caused some problems over the years. Within the conservative seminary, for many, many, many years, the focus of study was on halakha, was on Talmud, and much less on what one might call rabbinic. Uh, I don't know what term to use, but other things such as chaplaincy, pastoral care, um, social action, and so on. And so the divide between Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism continued to grow for many, many decades. And interestingly enough, the conservative pendulum has swung more to a bit of a liberal bent, whereas at the same time, the reform pendulum has swung to a little bit more of a traditional bent. And so the practice of Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism is, from most layperson's point of view, almost indistinguishable. From a conservative rabbi or a reform rabbi's point of view, much more distinguishable. There's much more of a difference between the the clergy aspect of these two streams of Judaism. So I don't want to get into necessarily all the history and the ideology and the theology and so on, but I want to talk about a few significant differences, predominantly between Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, that still do exist today, that would lend one to either consider themselves conservative or reform. Now, again, I'm talking about the actual tenets of reform versus conservative versus necessarily the real life out there in the world today practice. Okay? One of these has to do with the role of women. And although conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism are almost 100% similar in their practice right now, Reform Judaism was about 20 years ahead of the curve, so to speak, in terms of the role of women in synagogue life. Specifically, the role that women were permitted to play on the bima and the role of women rabbis. So in 1972, the first woman rabbi was ordained by the Hebrew Union College. That did not take place until at least 10 years later in the conservative movement. Reform Jews will pray without a minyan being described as 10 halachically Jewish men over the age of 13. Conservative congregations will still not have uh, a prayer service without a minyan, although women in most conservative congregations are considered to be part of a minyan, although there still are a handful of conservative congregations which do not include women in the minyan, which of course would make it very difficult for them to have a woman rabbi, because you can't very well have a woman rabbi leading a minyan of which she is not a part. I suppose you could. She could be the shaliach tzibur. She could be the one leading the service. But I do, in fact, know of a congregation that did have a female rabbi and would consider her part of the minyan on certain days of the week, but not on other days of the week. So um, that was an interesting arrangement for sure. The role of, or the acceptance of, intermarried couples in Reform congregations versus in conservative congregations is also a major difference. And this has been a difference for many, many years. In most Reform congregations, if there is a couple that is intermarried, so by that I mean the non-Jewish member of the couple, it has not converted to Judaism, because then that would be a Jewish couple. The non-Jewish spouse generally is considered a member along with the Jewish spouse. So when it comes time for a vote of some kind, whether that is a vote for a new rabbi, a change to something that's in the bylaws of the congregation, that non-Jewish spouse would have um, rights regarding those decisions made for the congregation. In many Reform congregations, a non-Jewish spouse will serve on committees, might even be a committee head. That, however, may not extend to all committees. For example, the ritual committee, or a committee that also has um, uh, interaction with communities of other faith traditions. So the role of the non-Jew Jewish spouse in congregational life is can be significant. The line may be drawn at certain religious practices. For example, if you have ever attended a bar or bat mitzvah of a child that's being raised in an interfaith family, usually the non-Jewish spouse is not included in certain parts of the service, meaning certain blessings, for example, that require the words Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Those words mean who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to. So, for example, the blessing for the Torah is a blessing that's incumbent upon Jews. The blessing Kiddush is incumbent upon Jews. The wearing of a tallis is a blessing that would be incumbent upon a Jew. So those blessings would generally not be, the privilege of those blessings would generally not be extended to a non-Jewish spouse, even in a Reform setting. An intermarried couple in a conservative context would, there would be a different treatment. The non-Jewish spouse would not be considered generally a member of the congregation. only the Jewish spouse. If a child is being raised by a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother in a conservative congregation, that child would not be called to the Torah as a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah unless and until that other parent converted to Judaism. We'll get to this in a minute. The parent converted to Judaism, or the child was brought to mikveh and converted. That's if the mother is not the Jewish partner and only the father. So, according to conservative Judaism, they abide very much by the halakha of who is a Jew, meaning that a Jewish child is a child born of a Jewish mother or of two parents who are Jewish, one of whom the mother is either born Jewish or has converted to Judaism, according to conservative practice. Very different from Reform Judaism, which has which about 20, 30 years ago adopted the rule of patrilineal descent, which says that if a child is being raised by two parents, one of whom is not Jewish and the other is Jewish, as long as that child is given a Hebrew name, either has a Brit Milah or a Brit Bat for a girl, in other words, is brought into the covenant, is raised Jewish, meaning practices the holidays, observes Shabbat with the family on Friday nights and Saturdays, is enrolled in a religious school program once they're old enough to be enrolled in a religious school program, is raised as Jewish as opposed to another faith tradition, then it doesn't matter if it is the father or the mother who is the born Jew. And this is a distinct difference between conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, in that conservative Judaism still holds that the mother must be Jewish. Now, you can feel about that however you feel about that, but it does have some real life modern day consequences. And one of those consequences is that given that more than 50% of all Jews are now intermarrying, very often the question will arise as to, especially if it is the woman who is not Jewish, what role they might play in a conservative congregation, especially if the children may not be considered Jewish without conversion, or unless the parent converts. So, I'm going to end it there because this is going to require a longer conversation. When we see each other again on Thursday morning at 9:30 for Chai There, we will talk about intermarriage, the role of women, and continue to talk about halakha and prayer and how that may differ in the conservative movement from the Reform and the Orthodox movement. And I'll talk a little bit more about history and how those divisions came to be between conservative and Reform in particular, because there were a lot of heated conversations and early on about how those divisions took place. So I'm going to invite you to come back on Thursday for more Chai There with Rabbi Leah. I hope that you will join me. And in the meantime, lehitraot, bye-bye. Have a wonderful day.